Let us look at how the first aorist subjunctive is formed. We are working with a diagnostic approach towards identifying verbs. For aorist subjunctives, the key diagnostics are: number 1, partially obscured tense formatives. You know the tense formatives for the indicative as sa and the or they. In the subjunctive, you're only going to see the consonant. You can think of sigma and theta respectively as the tense formative for the aorist subjunctive. Number 2, lengthened connecting vowels, eta or omega. You've encountered these before. They serve as the diagnostics for the subjunctive mood. Lengthened connecting vowels are a strong clue that you're looking at a subjunctive. And 3, primary personal endings. You would have seen secondary personal endings in the aorist indicative, but in the aorist subjunctive the endings are primary. Points to note: there's no augment. Augments only apply to the indicatives where real past time is being indicated. The tense formative is just sigma or theta for the passives, and the lengthened connecting vowel is diagnostic of the subjunctive. This is advanced information that you don't need to memorize, but it may help to understand what is really happening. In effect, the lengthened connecting vowel, eta or omega, overwrites the tense formative vowel in sa or the, which results in the combined tense mood formatives say and so for the active and middle, or they and tho for the passive. So in effect, when you have sa and you add eta, you're going to get say. When you have sa and you add omega, you're going to get so. The plus eta gives you they, and the plus omega gives you tho. Bill Mounce wisely prefers a simpler diagnostic. The tense formative is sigma for the aorist active or middle, and the tense formative is theta for the aorist passive. You then add the connecting vowel, which is lengthened, so it's either eta or omega, and that marks the subjunctive. So if you recognize sigma and theta as diagnostics for the aorist tense, active, middle, and passive respectively, and the lengthened connecting vowel eta and omega as marking the subjunctive, you should be able to recognize the aorist subjunctives. Let us look at the aorist active subjunctive forms. The aorist active subjunctive is recognized by the merged tense formative, sa, you're used to this from the indicatives, and the lengthened connecting vowel, eta or omega. The lengthened connecting vowel is a diagnostic for the subjunctive. You can simply think of say or so as the diagnostic for the first aorist active subjunctive. The subjunctive is most easily recognized and distinguished from the indicative by the absence of the augment. Remember, augments only apply to indicatives because the indicatives indicate real past time. Less intuitively, the subjunctive is distinguished by its use of primary active endings. The indicative uses secondary active endings. Here is a visual comparison of the indicative and subjunctives. Notice 3 things. The tense formative is sa throughout in the indicative, but it has become say and so in the subjunctive. We've seen this is because the lengthened connecting vowel overwrites the alpha. In the indicative, the augment is present throughout. It's absent in the subjunctive. And note too that the endings have changed. We have secondary active endings in the indicative, but we have primary active endings in the subjunctive. Here is a visual. We have the aorist tense stem plus the tense formative. It is shown simply as sigma. The alpha is grayed out and crossed out because it is never visible. It has been overwritten by the connecting vowel, which is lengthened. It will be omega or eta, and then the primary active personal endings are added. Lusso, I might loose. You can see the sigma is added, the lengthened connecting vowel, and there's no personal ending in the first person singular. Luso, I might loose. Luces, you might loose, in the singular. As is often the case, the second person singular is a little bit strange. You can see visually what's happening. It may be helpful to think of the personal ending as iota sigma, where the iota is optional. We've seen this in the present tense. In many tenses, the ending is simply sigma, but if you think of it as iota sigma, it may simplify memory. So what's happening in effect is lu plus sa plus a plus iota sigma. The alpha drops out because of the lengthened connecting vowel and the iota of the personal ending subscripts. Luces, you might loose. Luce, he, she, or it might loose. Luce. Lusomen, we might loose. Lusomen, we might loose. Lucete, you, plural, might loose. Lucete. Lusosi, they might loose. Lusosi. This is familiar. The actual personal ending is nu sigma iota with a movable nu, nsi, but the nu drops out when it stands between a vowel and sigma. So we end up in effect with just si or sin as the third person plural personal ending. Lusosi, lusosin, they might loose. Let's turn our attention to the aorist middle subjunctive. There is not much unexpected in this. The middle subjunctive has exactly the same diagnostics as the active. The tense formative, sigma alpha from the indicative, merges with a lengthened connecting vowel, eta or omega, which we've seen is diagnostic of the subjunctive. So we think of say or so as the diagnostic for the aorist middle subjunctive. Once again, we're not going to have an augment unlike the indicative, and less intuitively we're going to use middle passive primary endings, whereas the indicative uses the secondary endings. Here, for ease of reference, is the comparison between the indicative and subjunctive forms. Notice a few things. Firstly, notice the augment present in the indicatives. Notice also that the tense formative sigma alpha is partly obscured by the connecting vowel that's lengthened and overwrites the alpha in the subjunctives. Note also, which is not as easily spotted, that we are using the primary middle passive endings, my, tai, etc. For the subjunctive, the indicative used the secondary middle passive endings, main, to, nto, etc. Here are the building blocks of the aorist middle subjunctive. We have the aorist tense stem plus the tense formative, which simply becomes sigma. The alpha of the indicative is grayed and crossed out because it's never in view. It gets overwritten by the lengthened connecting vowel. The lengthened connecting vowel, either omega or eta, is diagnostic of the subjunctive mood, and then of course the personal endings. Notice that they are the primary personal endings. Lusomai, I might loose for myself. Lusomai, I might loose for myself. Once you've mastered the diagnostics, this is perfectly regular. Luce, you might loose for yourself. Luce, you might loose for yourself, singular. By now, you are very familiar with the fact that the second person singular forms are often irregular. We've shown here exactly what's happened. Essentially, the ending asai reduces to a, as it does in several other forms as well. Lucetai, he, she, or it might loose for itself. He, she, or it might loose for himself, herself, or itself. Wow, what a mouthful. Lucetai, lucetai. Nothing irregular here, a totally regular form. Lusometha, lusometha. We might loose for ourselves. Lusometha. Luceste, luceste. You, plural, might loose for yourselves. Luceste. Lusontai. They will loose for themselves. Lusontai. They will loose for themselves. Finally, we come to the aorist passive subjunctives. The aorist tense formative for the aorist passive is the, which we've seen in the form the with the epsilon lengthened to eta in the indicative mood. But we can think of the or they as the diagnostic for the aorist passive. When we come to the passive subjunctive, we also have a lengthened connecting vowel, eta or omega, exactly as we do in the active forms. And as we saw there, the lengthened connecting vowel overwrites the epsilon in the tense formative, which in effect gives us they and tho as the diagnostics for the aorist passive subjunctive. We are simply going to think of they or tho, the interchanging depending on which connecting vowel is used, as the chief diagnostic for the aorist passive subjunctive. The subjunctive is most easily distinguished from the indicative by the absence of the augment, and less intuitively by its use of primary active endings, whereas the indicative has secondary active endings. We've commented previously that aorist passives use active endings. Here's a visual presentation of the similarities and differences between the aorist passive indicative and the aorist passive subjunctive. Notice the tense formative. In the indicative it's they throughout. In the subjunctive it alternates between they and tho. This is because the connecting vowel is involved. Notice that the indicatives have an augment and the subjunctives do not. Notice too the different endings. Both use active endings, but the indicative uses the secondary active endings, whereas the subjunctive uses the primary active endings. Study this chart well until the distinction between the two is clear to you and you're able to explain it. Here we see the building blocks for the aorist passive subjunctive. It's built on the aorist passive tense stem. We then add the tense formative. The actual tense formative for the aorist passive is the, but the epsilon is shown as grayed out and crossed out because it disappears. It is effectively overwritten by the lengthened connecting vowel omega or eta. That lengthened connecting vowel is what you will recognize as the most telltale diagnostic for a subjunctive. And then we add the primary active personal endings. Lutho, I might be loosed. Lutho, I might be loosed. Luthes, you singular might be loosed. Luthes, you singular might be loosed. As is often the case, the second person singular form is a tad unorthodox. It might help to think of the personal ending as iota sigma, where the iota is optional or movable. If you do that, the form is easy to recognize. Luthe, he, she, or it might be loosed. Luthe, he, she, or it might be loosed. Luthomen, we might be loosed. Luthomen, we might be loosed. Luthete, you, plural, might be loosed. Luthete, you might be loosed. Luthosi, or luthosin, they might be loosed. Luthosi, luthosin, they might be loosed.